Hello everyone. In this video I'm going to show you how to build your very own reactive form controls in Angular 12 using Control Value Accessors. Okay, so before we get started, I just want to quickly mention that I will not be discussing the basics of reactive forms in this video. So if you have no experience whatsoever building a reactive form, I suggest you go find another video, learn how to do the basics, and then maybe come back to this video. With that said, I'm now going to show you what we're going to be doing right now. So basically what I've got is just a simple little form here with some settings on it. You can see it's basically capturing two checkboxes. So there's a checkbox for SMS notifications, and there is a checkbox for email notifications. The values that are assigned here are assigned to Boolean values at the moment. So for this one, we can see it's checked, so it's showing yes down here. And then for the email one, it's unchecked, so it's setting to no. So this is the default situation that we have. Now, if I change the values of both of these and then click submit, well, we can see now the values are being reflected down here. Pretty standard. This is a very simple reactive form. Okay. What I'm also going to show you here is the fact that we can disable controls and we can re-enable them, just like that. Okay. Now, as you can tell, this is not very interesting, and it's quite possible that a requirement's come in to improve this experience. And somebody said, okay, let's make this a slider control instead. Well, slider controls by default are not supported in Angular as form controls. So that's what we're going to be focusing on in this video. But let's have a look at the code that we have right now based on the current form that we have. So I've got the code in front of me with my project open. And by the way, for anyone who's asking, yes, I do have a copy of this code. It's on my GitHub account. I'll leave the information to getting this code in the description. Now, if I expand the source folder and I come into app and I have a folder called pages, then settings, I have basically a component here that represents that page. So I'll open up the settings component, TS, and the HTML file. So first I'll check out the TS, which is our component code line. And we can see we've got a form group here that I've got defined as a variable. And in the constructor, I'm instantiating that to basically be the result of a form builder group call. All right, so we got two controls that we're defining for this group. One is the allow SMS, and another one is the allow email. Now the values are set based on a settings field that we've got here, which, as we can see, is just got two flags: SMS set to true and email set to false, which is why we have the SMS checkbox checked by default and the email one unchecked. So that's pretty much all we need to know in here for the moment. If we go and check the template file, what we've got is basically a very simple form here with a form group applied to it. So it's pretty standard for reactive forms. And then we have an input of type checkbox that maps to each control. So there's allow SMS and allow email. Now we're linking it based on the attribute form control name. All right. So that's currently what we've got. Now, commented underneath each input control is actually a custom control which I've created called a slide toggle. So I'm going to uncheck those, and I'm going to comment out, or not, sorry, uncomment, and I'm going to comment out these ones, and then I'm going to save it, and I'm going to go back to see what we've got. So as you can see, the checkboxes are gone, and we have this slider component. Now, obviously, they're both just saying yes. So what that means is that we're not honoring the form controls at the moment for this component. It's just basically a user control that we can just toggle backwards and forwards, and that's it, right, for either one. So if I say yes and then no, or no and then yes in this case, and go submit, you can see no values down here will change, right? And that's because these are not wired up to be form controls. So the first step you might take is to actually add the form control name to the input, and then you would hope that that would work, all right? But before we try that, let's have a look at how this component actually works. So we'll jump back in the code and just take a quick look. So we're back in the code, and I'm going to keep this template file open, but we don't really need this one to remain open, so I'm going to close that. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to come down to where this slide toggle component is located. So in this code base, it's located under shared, controls, and then slide toggle. I'm going to open up the TS file and the HTML, and I could open the CSS, but I don't think we're really going to worry too much about that right now. So we'll come to the TS file first, and this is pretty straightforward. The key factor here is that this is checked flag is toggled on and off, right? So basically, this is the thing that we want to control in our form controls. Now, at the moment, it's just declared as a local variable to this component. And we have a toggle method, which basically is triggered when we click on a div, right, in our component. It then will basically toggle the state on and off, as long as it's not disabled, right? Which by default is always, well, in this case, it's always set to false, but we will fix this up a little bit later, all right? So it's pretty straightforward. That's all it really is. So it's just a root div with some spans that kind of updates the text based on whether it's checked or not. And then it obviously it moves a little button around based on whether it's checked or not. And that's all managed by classes and some custom animation inside of our CSS file, all right? So it's a little bit of CSS trickery there. Not much to explain, all right? All you really need to focus on here is the fact that this is checked, needs to be controlled by our form control. Well, and so is disabled, actually, to be honest. But we'll look at disabled a little bit later. So how do we, now that we understand what we're working with, convert this component to be accessible as a form control? Well, that's where I mentioned early on that we need to implement something called a Control Value Accessor. Now, there's two parts to it. There's one where you need to register this component with the reactive framework or the reactive part of Angular. And essentially how that works is that we need to register this component as an accessor using the NGValueAccessor provider. Now, how that looks is essentially like this. So first thing I'm going to do, and I'm just going to do some copying and pasting here. I'm going to paste at the top here, basically the Control Value Accessor interface and a constant that represents the injection token that you need to register this control or this component as a form control, okay? Now, I won't get into how injection works in Angular. That's a topic for a completely different video. But in order for this to work, we need to actually do some registration. And it looks a little bit like this. So if I go comma and paste in this code, well, I need to update this reference here. So let me just quickly do that. And I need to add that to the Angular core there. So what does this code actually do? Well, essentially, in short, it registers this component as a potential provider for a form control, okay? And it does this by using that NGValueAccessor as a key. So when reactive forms or a form group looks down your template now, if it finds this component and it finds it with a, say, form control or form control name attached to it, it's going to then look for special methods on your component, okay? And that's kind of initiated by this use existing forward ref, which is saying whatever this current provider is, the special methods you're looking for is going to be referred to this component, which is basically this one here, right? So at this point, we're saying the control value accessor logic that's needed for this component will actually be in this component, right? And multi is needed because you can have multiple ng value accessors. So any ng value accessor you ever write is always going to have multi set to true. That's just something you do in Angular, okay? So I'm going to actually move this over and save. And now the second step to this is to actually implement the control value accessor interface that we have up here. So I'm going to come down and I'm going to go implements, and then I'm going to put Control Value Accessor. Now, obviously, I'm going to get an error here because I haven't implemented the functions. So I'm just going to use the inbuilt IntelliSense there to help me. And now what that does is it produces 3 functions. Now I'm just going to cut these out for a second and move them underneath my variables just before the toggle. And I'll space them out a bit, so I like my spacing. And basically, these are the 3 functions that are required for a Control Value Accessor to do its thing in the Angular framework. Now, what do these 3 functions do? Well, the first one is write value. And what this is essentially used for is for you to wire up your component to accept an incoming value from a form control. So if we go back to the TS file, I know I said I wasn't going to need it, but I do need it. If I come back to the settings file, when we're writing this value into this control, and in this case it's during construction, but it could be if we go this dot form group dot get allow SMS dot set value, right? We could even do this and say false, right? If we do this, we're writing a value down into the control that's utilizing this, right? So in the case of our slide toggle, it's going to call this function, right? So we usually would do something like this. We'll go, okay, well, I need to update that is checked flag because that's the thing that's indicating the state of our component. So we can go this dot is checked is equal to obj. Now, I'm going to be honest with you. I don't like the fact that it's called obj, so I'm going to change it to checked, and I'm going to change the type to Boolean. All right, that's just so it looks more correct to me. But essentially, if we do that, right, and I'm going to take this code out. If we do this and we save, and then we come over to our settings page component, and before we do that, let's comment out these exceptions for the moment. If we do all that, we come to our settings page, and now what we do is we register this as the form controls. So let's say we do that, and then for the other one, we grab this one and we assign that here, like so. If we save this and now we go and check the application, and look at that. So now we've got the ability to write to our control. So if we remember, by default, we had the SMS notifications configured to be on, but we had the emails already configured to be off, right? So now you can see it's actually switched to an unchecked state, or in this case, we say no, right? But the one thing we haven't handled, or there's a couple of things we haven't handled here. One is if we change it, like so, and click submit, well, nothing happens, right? These values don't get updated, right? So it's not propagating. We also can't disable it, right? Or enable it at the moment. This is also ineffective. So let's deal with the first one, which is if we change the value and click submit, how do we go about getting this to work? Let's jump back in the code and I'll show you how this is done. So I'm back in the code and I'm going to come over to my slide toggle component, the one which we implemented the Control Value Accessor. And now we're going to look at this second method, which is register on change. Now, what this actually takes is a function, believe it or not, even though it says any, this is actually a function that you have to explicitly call when you yourself in this component have changed the value. So in our component, it's when we change the value of checked, or is checked, I should say. That's when we need to call this function to let the form control that's registered against this component update its value accordingly, right? So it looks a little something like this. So the first thing we need to do is we need to register an on change here in our component. So I'm just going to put any for the moment, but I'll change the type in a second. And then all I need to do in here is go this dot on change is equal to fn, which I will change this at least to on change, like so, and assign it appropriately. I'll also get rid of the comment. Now this is just the first step, right? we need to also call this at some point, right? Where we need to call it is when we change the is checked value, which is down here, okay? So just after this has been assigned, I'm now going to call this dot on change, passing in this dot is checked, all right? Now, because this is a Boolean flag and I'm comfortable that this is always going to be a Boolean flag, I'm going to actually change this function here to be an arrow function. So I'm going to set this with a value, or we can say, yeah, is checked, and that's going to be Boolean, and that's going to return a void, right? So this is the signature we're going to use for our on change, and I'm going to assign it there as well, okay? Now, with this change alone, or these changes alone, this should now propagate whenever we check on the slider toggle, the value of is checked up to the form control, and when we press submit, we should now see the reflected changes. Well, let's check that out. So we're back on the screen, and now what we'll do is we'll toggle each one to the opposite directions, and now SMS down here should be no, and email should be yes when I click submit. And there you go, look, it actually changed. So now we have the ability of changing these whenever we like, right? So we can turn them on, submit, turn them off, submit, and so on and so forth, right? Now, what we still can't do is we can't disable the control. So if I click disable, you can see that they're both still able to be changed, which is not really that good, right? We still want to be able to have the ability to disable controls and enable them and things like that. So now let's have a quick look on how we can do that. So we're back in our slide toggle component, and now we want to know how we can implement a disabled, right? So we've got this flag here already, but it's always set to false, right? We want to control this from our form control from the outside. So how do we do that? Well, if we looked at when we implemented Control Value Accessor, we only actually got 3 methods. We've seen write value, we know what that does. We've seen register on change, we now know what that does. And then there's this register on touched. Now, this isn't actually used for disabling the control. This is for something else, and I'll come back to it in a minute. But when we implement Control Value Accessor, we have to implement all 3 of these, okay, regardless of whether we use them or not. But this interface also has a 4th function. If we scroll all the way down, so register on change, register on touched, and now there's this one called set disabled state, right? This one is actually optional. You don't need to implement this, but you know, for the purpose of this example, we're going to, all right? So what I'm going to add under register on changed is a function that I'm just going to copy and paste in that looks like what we need it to be, right? So there's our set disabled state, there's our Boolean flag. So this is actually really, really simple, right? All we really need to do is just go this dot disabled equals is disabled, right? And if we save this and we go back to the form, and now if I come over here and I click on the disable button, well, look at that. The styles have now changed on the buttons, right? They're actually applying a style that I've set inside the code, which sets a class of disabled. You also can see that if I try to click on them, they won't actually do anything, all right? Because it's setting that disabled flag. If I click enable again, now we can change them and we can submit, and everything is how we expect it to be. All right, so that's really, really cool. Now, the last thing that we'll talk about before we end this video is the registered on touched. So before we go back to the code, let's have a look at form controls in general. So if I hover over our component now, and we look at the DOM for this, what you're going to see on our actual element is a whole bunch of attributes, right? But what's most important is the classes. So as you can see at the moment, the class here says ng untouched and ng dirty, right? Now, when we change the value of a control, it will actually set this ng dirty flag. And we can see that by when we refresh and we target this for the first time, and we find the actual attribute. Now you can see it says ng pristine. What this means is basically the control hasn't been interrogated in any way yet. But as soon as we click on it, now we can see that it is in fact dirty. So this tells the form control, hey, look, you've edited something, and currently it's valid because we don't have any reason to make it invalid. But basically, you know, this is the behavior that we have, all right, for ng dirty. But you'll see it still says untouched. Now, technically, this is not true. We did just change this, right? So we need to flag this in our component to say that once we've clicked on it, that it has in fact been touched. So that's what we're going to do right now. So we're back on our component, and now what we're going to do is we're going to ensure that we tell our form control that on the first time that our toggle is clicked, that we have actually touched it, okay? So what that's going to involve is us adding a Boolean flag here, just saying is touched, or something to that nature. And we're going to set this to false by default. And then we're going to come down to our register on touched. We're actually going to create another function. So here we are going to have on touch, right? We'll set it to any for the moment. And then we're going to use that to register on touch, right? So on touch equals fn. Again, I'm going to change this to on touch, like so, just for better names, right? And essentially, all we really need to do here is mark whether this actually happened or not. So we only need to call this once. So this is really just a void function like so. So I'm going to do the same up here. I'm going to update this to an on void function. And I also have to specify that with an exclamation there because it's Angular 12. And now that we've registered that function, we need to call it at the appropriate moment. So is touch by default is false. So if we come down to our toggle and we've got we're not disabled, right? We now need to, after probably this code here, indicate if this is a touch, right? So if this dot was it first touch, did I call it? Is touched. If it's not touched, sorry, then, so basically, if not touched, therefore we've never touched this before, we're going to set it to true. All right, so this is true. And then we're going to set on touch, or we're going to call on touch. So this will tell the form control, or the control in the form group, hey, look, it's been touched. And this Boolean flag will prevent it from continuously firing this, because touch should only really happen the first time you touch this control. So now if we save this and we go back and take a look at what we have in our web page. So now looking at my component, I can see it's untouched and it's also pristine. If I click on it, now you can see the ng touched class has been applied and not the ng untouched, right? If I subsequently click it, you can see that it stays ng touched. It also stays ng valid and ng dirty because, well, at this point it is dirty. It's a dirty field, right? But it's also valid because there is no invalid state here. Cool. So that's pretty much it. That's how you can build your own custom control using Control Value Accessors. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like the video, subscribe to my channel, and hit that notification bell. And I'll see you all next time.